Hello, everyone. My name is Olivier Thierry. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Zimbra, and today we are joined by Dr. Larry Ponemon, Chairman and Founder of the Ponemon Institute, a research think tank dedicated to advancing privacy, data protection, and information security practices. Dr. Ponemon is considered a pioneer in privacy auditing and the Responsible Information Management, or RIM framework. Security Magazine has named Dr. Ponemon as one of the most influential people for security. Welcome, Larry. Well, that's quite a title. I mean, you know, the most influential persons for security. Yeah, that's quite an accolade. Is that a good thing or a bad thing these days?
It's a good thing to be so influential in security. It's like being most influential in bank robbery or something like that. Kind of a scary place.
Well, thanks for joining us today. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. The style of these webinars for us is really more conversational around some really hot topics, and of course, privacy, open source, the future of messaging, security. These are all hot topics. So let's get right to the issue. Today, we're going to be talking about several topics related to data privacy and security, open source, and the future of collaboration messaging. And Larry, I can't imagine, but I just bet you've done a lot of research or work around security and data privacy. First of all, give us a little bit of a thumbnail in terms of the work that you've done in that area, and then what do you think in these last few years has had the most impact on, say, data privacy?
Well, that's a good starting question. I've kind of been in the privacy or information ethics arena for, I hate to admit this, but about more than 40 years. I started my career as a cryptologist in the Navy and kind of went on from there, working either in the security domain or in the privacy domain. But privacy was something that was, certainly not a major point of discussion when we first started to look at these issues. But information ethics has been a big issue for many, many decades, probably since the beginning of time. In terms of background, I started my career, as I mentioned, as a Navy cryptologist, but was also worked in the intelligence community. Don't hold that against me, by the way. It was fun. And then also was a consultant and partner, and then ultimately a senior partner, first with KPMG and then with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was also a university professor, and then about a little over 13 years ago, we started the institute, Ponemon Institute, which, by the way, is dedicated to privacy, data protection, and information security. So that's my circuitous background. Sometimes I'll tell only my close friends. My deep dark secret, I actually started my career before the Navy as a musician. I was a hippie, and I tried my hand at being a professional guitarist. I failed miserably, so I had to do something else. And so unfortunately, I found privacy, data protection.
Wow. Well, you and I should compare notes because I was also in that same era, but I was a drummer, but an aspiring drummer at the time.
Cool.
So, in terms of data privacy, in the last few years, what do you think has happened or has had the most impact, and what are we seeing in terms of trends in that area?
Oh, great question. Things that affect privacy, it's just an enormous set of factors, so we can't possibly go into each one. But definitely, as a general rule, just the emergence of information technologies and the growth of information about people, and the ability to put together facts and figures about individuals and then profile people in great detail with a lot of accuracy. These kinds of issues have created potentially wonderful opportunities for society and for economic opportunities for business and national security opportunities, but it's also had an effect of diminishing our privacy because there's just so much information. We can't possibly control all of that information. And the other issue with privacy is once the information is out the door, you can't get it back. This concept that, the right to be forgotten, which is cool, conceptually, it's a good idea, but operationalizing that is very difficult, if not impossible, because, again, that one piece of information can flow to a million places in an instant, and you lose control immediately as a consumer, as an individual, as a citizen.
Yeah, so once the privacy genie is out of the unsecured bottle, tough luck. It's out there, right? So,
absolutely.
In light of this is a really interesting moment in time, and given the last 45 to 60 days, we've seen a lot of movement. This is circa end of December 2014 to middle of January. What with I think the biggest incident being obviously the Sony hacking that went on, and now of course all of the hey, what did you say about me, and how much are you paying that person, and I need to renegotiate that contract because you're paying them 2x what I'm getting paid on those movies. That's obviously the genie being, literally out of the bottle. But in light of that incident, and in light of what went on even a couple of years ago with Edward Snowden, I mean, if you think about the numerous security incidents and disclosures of government espionage and surveillance, and the lasting effects on consumers' attitudes, could you comment on that? What are we seeing? What do people think now? What does John Q. Public think? What do corporations think about this?
Well, we've been studying the issue of consumer perceptions about their privacy and about their control over their information, whether they feel they have some control or no control whatsoever. And in general, we find that people just recognize the fact that their privacy is diminished significantly or may not even exist at all. Despite that, most people really want to have privacy. They want to have that place that they can go to where no one's going to hear them talking on a cell phone. They want to be in a place where if they provide information, because they don't have to worry about that information ending up in the hands of an abusive marketer or even worse than that, an abusive criminal.
Yet they want that, but then again, they'll go on Facebook and post where they are.
Yeah, that's the weird thing about privacy. So people will say, oh, I really want privacy. But when you ask people, what do you do to protect yourself? They say, nothing. I don't do anything to protect myself.
No, in fact, I do the opposite. All right, I broadcast where I am or where I'm not, and therefore, people who want to get into my house know exactly that I'm not there because I'm somewhere else as posted on Facebook.
Absolutely. It's kind of interesting because we look at, we've been studying this for years and years and years, and we came up with a methodology for this is boiling the ocean, but taking a population and kind of putting it into three buckets. And one category of privacy sensitivity we call privacy-centric, and these are people who really seem to care about their privacy enough to do things that might actually cause them to suffer some inconvenience. They'll stand on a longer line, or they won't actually buy something they really want to buy from a website they really don't know very well. And so privacy-centric people represent just globally about 14% of the adult age population. About 60-some% are people who are privacy-sensitive, who will tell you that they care about privacy, but they'll post these absolutely horrible pictures on their Facebook or LinkedIn. I mean, they basically don't do anything to protect their privacy, although they say they care about it. And then about the remaining 20-some-odd% are people who are privacy complacent. And these are people who just will tell you flat out they don't care about their privacy and they don't worry about it. And then many of the people in that category are younger people. People might have regrets, right now they don't mind having that weird picture of drinking, chugging beer or drinking alcohol or smoking marijuana. But when they ultimately apply for a major job like CEO of a company or senator, those pictures will show up, and that's just kind of the nature of the privacy complacent category. So the majority of people are not privacy centric, even though we could safely say that privacy is important at least to many people.
So with the assumption that now people are at least aware, even if they choose, perhaps convenience or nonchalance versus security, but they're aware. And I guess also, if I were to think back over the last few weeks, as I've watched several television news reports on Sony, the word encryption must have come up at least hundreds, if not thousands of times. And it seems to me that even for those people who are completely risk averse, even somebody like my wife would know what encryption is now, whereas she didn't know what this was a year ago. I mean, are we finally reaching a point of meaningful, widespread adoption of technologies? I mean, you've been in the cryptology business since the days in the Navy, but is it now mainstream?
It's getting there. It's still not mainstream in places like the United States. It's definitely mainstream in Europe, especially countries like Germany, France, the Netherlands, and so forth. But it is definitely becoming more important. Encryption is a technology that's been around for ages, but many people were afraid of encryption because they felt it was too complex to implement or would slow them down, or, again, it goes back to that convenience versus safety and security. But I think people recognize the fact that information, like in an email, photographs, it doesn't have to be like words, it could be documents. You really want to make sure that it's protected. And encryption is just a smart thing to do. Plus, the technologies have become a lot better. Number one, a lot easier to use. Sometimes it's invisible to the end user, so the good person that does something stupid, well, they are unable to do the stupid thing now because the technology is embedded in the device or in the application. So encryption has become much, much more important. And I say encryption, this would include a family of cryptological technologies, like tokenization would fall in that category, digital data masking technologies. There are technologies that are not technically encryption, but they kind of do the same thing and might be preferred in certain applications.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because obviously the latest versions of the iPhones, come with a lot of biometric encryption. So that's kind of, it's kind of like, you want to use the phone? Here's the best way to use it. And they've actually married convenience with great security, which I think is a win from a customer perspective. If you think about it now from a corporate perspective, let's sort of flip the lens a bit here. So we've got those three buckets for consumers. How are there buckets, and are there behavioral patterns for corporations? Or do they fall in the same buckets, or how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't really have the same framework for an organization, although obviously organizations are composed of people, and privacy is not just a corporate thing, it affects the individual. So, just like we might worry about our privacy as a consumer, we also might worry about our privacy as an employee of a company, for example. And if we kind of think about it in that context, the three buckets that I mentioned before would apply. But there are organizations that, if you kind of look at, some organizations are leaders, if you will, for good privacy practices. And I don't think they do it for altruistic reasons. I think they do it because it's good for business. It differentiates them, the organization, in their marketplace. Companies that rate very, very high, and we've been studying, in fact, we prepare a study every year called the Most Trusted Companies for Privacy, and we're just about to release our 2014 results. And in general, we find that the same cast of characters are on the good list, and the same cast of characters are on, like, the bad list, the companies that are least trusted for privacy. We don't publish the negative, but on the positive side, companies like American Express always appear in the top 1 or 2 slot. Amazon, very strong results. eBay, a lot of e-commerce companies that really have a lot at stake if they're not trusted, and so therefore privacy becomes kind of an enabling factor to differentiate their service and to position them properly. Apple, for example, has a very strong following, and therefore a lot of trust it's a trusted organization, and privacy is important. Now, on the negative side,
I also think too that the usual suspects, anybody who's taking transactions and requires secure transactions, it's part of their DNA and culture to be as secure as they can possibly be. But I'm sure on your since it's the time of the season, or was the time of the season, on your naughty and nice list. On the naughty list, I mean, obviously, we've got a new supreme champion in Sony that sort of reigns out there. I mean, that's become publicly chastised and almost ridiculed for the lack of security. And I'm pretty sure that they're going to work really hard to get on the nice list over the next few years. But why do companies wait? I mean, I guess that's the point. If it's so obvious for an eBay, so obvious for a PayPal, so obvious for all those, for Amazon or for American Express, why is it less than obvious that the trust of sensitive documents, the trust of all the email traffic that's going on between the parties that were, let's say, dealing with a Sony, why wasn't it obvious to them? And why do they have to wait until an incident occurs before something is done? Why does that occur?
There are lots of reasons for it. I mean, when we study, the aftermath of a large data breach, for example, like Target and, of course, Sony and Chase and Home Depot has a pretty long list. of these mega data breaches involving 1 million or more records. But when we study these, we find that a lot of organizations are operating in what I call ignorance is bliss zone. In other words, they just don't know there's a problem, so they generally assume it's okay. Also, we see a huge gap between the C-level and the rank-and-file employees. You talk to someone in security and you ask them the question, how good is your security? Rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. And you probably get it like about a 5 on average, maybe a 6, maybe a 6.5. Same question to like the chief information security officer, even worse than that, the CIO, and they'll give you a 10 or a 10 plus or a 9.5. And this gap, unfortunately, is a problem because the decision makers, the influencers, the people who control the budget, are the people who somehow generally believe they're okay because they haven't heard about the problem. And that's changing because boards of directors have potential individual liability if they mess up and they're grossly negligent. And we're going to start to see, I think, as boards become more active, it's pushing up the responsibility. And we're even starting to see, like in the case of Target, where C-level, like CEOs and CIOs and other C-level executives lose their jobs because of their complacency or their inability to operate at the A level, if you will, on security.
Larry, do you think that we'll ever see something like the equivalent of Sarbox as it relates to InfoSec?
Good question. I think that regulations are kind of the second best alternative, right? It's better to have good practices that are being implemented. And then secondly, it would be, if you can't do it because it's the right thing to do, having regulations, like Sarbanes-Oxley or, PCI or NIST and a whole bunch of others becomes kind of the second best way of doing it. But obviously, the ideal world would be companies say, look, this is good for business. We don't want to be the next Sony. We don't want to be the next Home Depot. We're going to implement, even if there aren't requirements to do so.
Yeah. Let's switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about regional differences between EMEA and the U.S. as it relates to security and privacy. As you've done, tons of research in both these geographies, can you comment on, what is considered security in Europe versus what is considered security in North America and how they differ, and how they differ along the lines of data privacy?
Sure. So, there are fundamental differences between the U.S. and certain European countries. And I say certain because Europe is just so diverse that comparing, folks in Romania to folks in the Netherlands to folks in Norway, there's just lots of cultural differences. But in general, Europeans tend to hold their privacy rights as a more important asset, if you will. It's something that's more important for the average European than for the average American. And the reason for that, there are lots of reasons for it, but number one reason is, in general, the European world looks at the owner of the information about you is you're the owner. If it's your information, you own it. You may loan it, like any other asset, to a organization, but but the general view is that it's your information, no matter who touches that information for various purposes, legitimate purposes, like selling a product or shipping something to your home address. But that ownership issue doesn't exist in the U.S. In general. When we surrender that information, we fill out a form online or we go to the bank and, we provide our personal information to a company. The general view is that company now owns that. That's not yours anymore. You don't even have co-ownership of it. It's not your asset. And so the concept of information ownership is a big deal because organizations in Europe are more respectful because they realize that information is on loan to them. In the U.S., the general view is, hey, if you were dumb enough to provide that personal information or you weren't paying attention to the details, so be it. It's now in the hands of a company, and the company will call that in their own asset. They will basically control it and not necessarily give you any opportunity to co-own it or to control it in some cases. So that's definitely a major difference between Europe and the U.S. And it does vary, as I mentioned before, Germany being probably one of the most pro-privacy / information ownership society in the world. But there are other countries, Italy, France, the UK, very, very strong privacy cultures.
And so I can immediately see the parallels, obviously, in the private sector where, it's being used for AdWords or, marketing and that kind of stuff and to sell you more product or whatever. But it also is an interesting dimension when used by governments. So essentially, if you've foregone your rights to ownership of your privacy data, then by signing them away or whatever to, let's say, a list or a service provider that has a list, et cetera, and then that service provider gets subpoenaed, let's say, by a government agency, then where do the rights belong for that data then at that point in time? And can you contrast that with how that would look, let's say, in EMEA versus here in the U.S.?
Sure. It's a real controversy right now in the cloud computing world. And the idea is that if you are a cloud service provider, and say you're located in the United States, and you might have a hard time convincing a German company to move the data to a server in the United States, because once it's here, it's basically information can be used by different organizations and government authorities for purposes of national security. So companies and countries that are sensitive to privacy are concerned about working with cloud providers that have a home base in the U.S., or even cloud providers that are in the U.S. They're technically a U.S. company, and they have their servers in places like Ireland, for example, are potentially creating more risk for European citizens. So in general, I think we see that organizations, because the world that we live in today, we don't have companies just operating in one country. Most companies, even boom companies that have a website, are operating outside the United States. But the concept of where that information is located becomes a big deal and can actually create reasons for an entire industry like the cloud industry to suffer greatly. So we're starting to see some of that right now.
Right. So while I might be in Europe, let's say, and I'm using, let's say, a global provider of messaging in Europe, and I'm of the presumption that the data that I've got there is private and owned by me, and I have not foregone those rights. But because they're running on a server that might be owned necessarily, let's say, by a U.S.-based provider of messaging services, that data then could be subject to another government's desires to inspect that data. That really then goes, that as you said, that's quite a controversy. That brings up a whole bunch of I would say in EMEA, probably a whole bunch of human rights issues.
It's a big deal, not just in Europe, but even Canada, for example, to the U.S. data that is, again, in the control of a U.S. organization. That organization will likely share information about another country's citizens as part of national security. And, I know most of us would say I worry more about companies, not government, but government can be pretty abusive. And, governments change. Good people leave office and bad people become leaders. And so things can happen to be devastating, not only to American citizens, but to folks in other countries simply because their data is located on a system owned by a U.S. company.
Is there something that Europe does really, really well regarding privacy and security that the U.S. could learn from, or vice versa? Is there something that we do really well here in the U.S. that India could learn from?
Well, it's kind of interesting because even though privacy is considered really important in Europe, more so maybe than the United States, generally speaking, companies in the U.S. have better controls over data protection. And it's kind of weird because you would think that a company that really is into privacy, they would invest in better technologies like encryption and so on. Yeah. But there's no evidence to suggest that European countries generally are doing a lot more to secure the data. Now, that being said, there are some exceptions to the rule. In almost every Ponemon study that we've done since the beginning of time, it seems like more than 13 years, Germany is usually an outlier. Germany is first to use encryption or tokenization technologies. Germany is first to use advanced authentication controls and dual-factor authentication. German companies just tend to be much more oriented to data protection and have better skills to do that than U.S. companies. But other countries and companies in other countries, other parts of Europe, just seem to be below, in many cases, what we are doing here in the U.S. in terms of securing the data.
Sounds like Enigma version 40.6 or something like that, probably out of Germany. Let's switch gears and talk about what the elements that are probably accelerating or exacerbating the issues relative to security and privacy, and that is mobile, right? So, I think we all have our iPhones. We all have the great desire for this wonderful device to be in our pockets, and we walk into the company every day, and on this device we are receiving corporate information, we are sending corporate information, we are mixing it together with our own personal information, and this has got to be IT security's probably worst nightmare come true, which is, bring your own insecure device. Is that it?
I know, it's funny, like BYOD, BYOC, BYOA, BOYXYZ. It's crazy. There's so many things that can happen. First, the mobile device itself, even if it's a company-assigned device, can actually put organizations in a world of hurt if the device isn't secure. And some devices, for example, BlackBerry historically have been very secure, but they're limited. People want to have things like an Android device because they can get all these cool apps and do all sorts of things on their device. So in general, I think that the mobile platform and mobile technology, which is great for organizations, productivity, does great things for us, but it also creates a firestorm, and a perfect firestorm for privacy and security issues. And we just know that that's happening. But the good news, I believe it's good news, that companies are seeing that this is a big problem, and they're spending real, tangible resources to make this less of a problem. But it's a type of a problem that whatever you fix today, there'll be a new invention and a new disruptive technology tomorrow, and that problem will appear again, or a new problem will kind of rise up. And that's just the nature of security, actually.
Yeah, it's also the nature of disruptive change. I mean, you and I were on a call yesterday with a journalist, and we talked about why is this phenomena occurring? And it's almost like, if you look back at the history of computing, you always go from this highly centralized and controlled to highly decentralized and user-friendly, and you're trying to create that balance while disrupting and moving forward with technology advancements. The mainframe folks didn't want to bring in the PCs, and then the server guys didn't want to bring in phones, and so it's kind of like you see this history of push and pull. I often use the word centributed, which is like the ability to centrally control things, but yet being able to facilitate convenience and distribution. But I think if we think about messaging specifically, and if we think about because that's probably the biggest core fear that most people have around a mobile device. It's because everything, that's the superhighway in and out of that mobile device. It's where attachments get put into an email and sent out. What are some of the advancements as you sort of think through here? What are you seeing in terms of trends regarding mobility and security for corporations, let's say?
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned before, even though there are security risks, a lot of organizations and see the mobility as and safe and secure mobility, hopefully, as a very, very important a part of the IT mission. And even not to just IT, it actually spreads to the end users and business owners, or heads of lines of business. It's not just, again, an IT issue, although a lot of the strategy and decision making around mobility seems to be in the IT domain. We did a study on that a few years ago, and I'm sure it's changed. But in general, I think what we want to see is mobility that allows people to have choice. They choose applications that make them productive, use devices that make them that they like, so that they're likely to be more productive because they're using something they know, but do it in ways that are safe and secure without potentially compromising productivity and without creating a command and control infrastructure, like Big Brother is watching you every step of the way. So organizations are, it's as you said, it's push and pull, and so right now it's kind of in the push side, because it's so productive. Organizations are getting so much benefit out of mobility that there's this tidal wave to just do it. And sometimes we rush things too quickly, and we see that in apps. Mobile apps are just rushed out because the economy is such that there's an appetite to get the next greatest app, but some of the apps that are being used have inherent insecurity that could be very dangerous for companies. But I think companies are putting resources into this, and we're starting to see smart decisions being made around security in the mobility space.
Yeah, and just like your example before, where the chief security officers think that their security is a 10, and the folks that are implementing think it's a 4 or 5. The biggest offenders for mobility are probably the C-level execs who first started bringing these devices in and saying, I'm just using it because it's cool, I like it, it's convenient, and it's part of me. It's my lifestyle. It expresses who I am. These devices are very, if you look at the way entirely how Apple goes to market, it's all about making it essentially a personal accessory that is what you wear as much as what you use. So it's kind of a fashion statement come productivity tool, and so it's hard to dislodge that. It really is hard to change that mindset. Are there any companies out there that forbid, or sort of that of that sort of say, no, you're going to use this corporate phone and wear a bat belt. I don't care what you have on your other phone, but but here's what you're going to use here. I mean, is that a trend, or is that a successful trend, or is that where do we stand on that?
I've never heard of a company that successfully said, we made a mistake and we allowed you to use your device, but we're going back to the dark ages and you have to use BlackBerry or a company side. Not to pick on BlackBerry, but a company.
That's right. Welcome to pagers. That's right.
Yeah, we are going back to pagers. But there are actually examples of that. For example, healthcare. It's interesting that you mentioned pagers. Pagers are still used, and so you have doctors that have like a tablet, like a state-of-the-art tablet, maybe a state-of-the-art smartphone, and they have a pager. And the reason for that is the regulations sometimes make it hard to kind of use some of the latest and greatest technologies. But it's changing. I think most organizations couldn't win that battle if they try to pull back and say, we're just too generous and you can't use the cloud applications you like. You can't do Dropbox. You can't do Box.net. We're really sorry. We changed our mind. It would create a riot in the typical company, I think. It would be a big problem.
Yeah, that's a huge, by the way, that last comment about, Box and Dropbox, I mean, that's a huge issue, the data leakage that occurs by the ability to share anything, if you will. I mean, we lock our stuff down. We use our own, our own file sharing technology called Sync and Share. And what we do is we lock it down with secure private attachments and making sure that there's no data leakage. But it's tough to, prior to that, it was tough to manage the data leakage. Just as a side note on, since it's kind of mobile as well, it intersects with mobility. What is your sense, or what are people telling you about Box, Dropbox, and just their corporations and how they feel about them right now? I mean, it's kind of like that convenience versus oh my gosh factor, right?
Yeah, the organizations definitely are sensitive to this issue of people, the employee saying, I want to work. I have a project to do for my company, and I'm going to have 4 or 5 of my friends. Some of these people might be outside the organization to help support some of the things I need to do, and so a lot of data, and sometimes the most sensitive and precious data, is basically leaking out unbeknownst to the company. The company doesn't know that this is happening until it's too late. And even when the project is completed and there's no reason to have these documents on file, they basically just sit out there. They're now removed. And the company might have a copy, for backup purposes. And that, again, is subject to attack by bad guys. So, unfortunately, a lot of organizations, again, our ignorance is bliss, I mentioned before. They don't actually see the problem, so they're not worrying about the problem. But they're starting to understand that this could be the potential perfect storm for data leakage, and it's the type of data, unlike, some of the mega breaches where you get millions of records, payment credentials or whatever, Those are big. Those are really nasty events. But it's maybe even worse if a company loses high value, a small amount of high value data. It could be the design of a new product or marketing plan, board of director meetings, and that's the kind of stuff that really kills you. And we saw that with Sony. It's that small little leakage of celebrities created more noise than the fact that it was potentially millions of records at stake.
Yeah. Let's switch gears now. I want to talk a little bit about open source with you right now, since it's also it's at an interesting crossroads. Is it finally time? Is it finally time for open source to come of age and say it's a viable delivery method for software, or do people still believe that this is the coding choice of hackers? Where do we sit with sort of the opinion and raison d'être and state of the art with open source?
Sure. So, we did our study, by the way, sponsored by your wonderful company, so thank you. And the study was independently conducted by Ponemon Institute. And what we found in general is that open source commercial open source is viewed very favorably for a number of reasons. But one that's near and dear to my heart is the whole issue of visibility and the security it creates. So for example, if you're a closed source proprietary application, and there's a problem, some kind of a vulnerability is revealed, that organization is hopefully responsible for creating a suitable patch, and that could be days, weeks, months, or even longer to kind of do that. In the world of open source, if there is a problem, it's basically you have a community of users and people who can kind of fix it and get this implemented in a way that's more timely and more effective for the company. So the visibility, it creates kind of a sense of integrity and trustworthiness that you wouldn't see in the closed source environment. But despite that, a lot of people, especially the folks who have been in IT for a long time, they somehow have this view that, well, if it's open source, it's built by hackers, or it's really not going to have the same quality as a closed source proprietary application. So that bias probably still exists, but it's becoming, I think, more and more companies are starting to see the value. And so my prediction is open source, commercial open source, will basically at some point become kind of the dominant choice for applications.
Are you seeing any attitude shifts with governments or government agencies?
Governments probably have been the most difficult time kind of moving from the proprietary to open source. But I think we see kind of initiatives for open source, again, around that visibility. It gives people more control over the code and the ability to do new and better things. And it also helps you to see where there are defects. And I think government, some of the government initiatives like open source, and I think you could help me with the title. I think it's like, open source 1 or open source first. These initiatives have actually, the potential to make open source even more popular.
Yeah, we see that in several parts of the world too, where they have an open source first kind of policy right now, because they're not only did they believe that they were going to get more security, but they thought they were, and they correctly surmised that they're going to get better quality overall, because it's many more eyeballs looking at what's going on in the code. And what's interesting too, just to follow up on your last point, Ari, too, when a lot of people, so this is kind of the counterintuitive piece, right? Before we were talking about, I don't want to share stuff to a lot of people, and then in open source, it's quite the contrary. You actually do want to share, but you want to share in a way that's orchestrated and secure, and then be able to deliver the benefits of having many, many more eyeballs looking at the problem. And then the final step to that is that customers can actually, of open source software, can actually verify that what was put in place actually fixes the issue. So not only is there a mean time to respond, which is much shorter, with many, many more people looking at how to solve it, but there's also that great visibility of being able to trust that what was fixed is actually fixed. I mean, is that what, did you get that sense as well from some of the research that you've done?
Yeah, so we've done a number of studies on patching, and what we find is, of course, that most people know this to be true, that many patches are in fact not solving the problem, but exacerbating the problem because it's either funky code or it doesn't really address the true attack vector. So having eyeballs on the problem and good people to kind of solve the problem and the visibility of knowing that it's working or not, I think makes it a very attractive alternative.
Any thoughts on, I think that, any community that works in open source, you always have a risk that there are guys that are out there that are not doing the right things. But
Right.
I actually, any thoughts on the fact that communities tend to self-police themselves? So, in other words, you might, if you're an old-style corporate IT person believing that it's, these are hackers that are working there, what I believe is that most people don't realize that these communities tend to self-police themselves, and they recognize when code gets added that was nefarious. Have you done any research in that area, or have you thought, or have you seen any trends in that area?
Yeah, we've looked at that issue, and you're absolutely right. The open source, by its very nature, creates a community, and the community is motivated to have good code. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about being altruistic. It's about making sure that the code works and that it doesn't have the junky stuff, which can in fact be the dangerous junky stuff that's planted by potential bad guys. So that self-policing and the visibility into the code, I think, creates a much more secure and much more trustworthy environment.
Is there anything we can learn from the incidents and the vulnerability disclosures that we've seen in 2014 and that we'll probably see going forward this year in terms of how to apply those to an open source software to make it more secure? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it goes back to the code itself and making sure that the code is programmed with not just, good code that gets the job done, but secure code. And so, basically we're the problem. If you look at, application insecurity, whether you're closed or open source, it starts with the code itself, and is it being done in ways that are contemplating some of the security issues and privacy issues as well. There are initiatives like, for example, Canada and the former Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Information Privacy Commissioner, Ann Kabukian, created this concept called privacy by design. So before you build an application that captures sensitive, confidential information about customers and employees, you basically build those controls into the application. And it's very effective and actually cost-effective because you're putting things in after the fact never work as well, and usually is unfortunately it could be very costly. Similarly, there are initiatives called security by design, making sure the code is safe and secure. There's an organization called Safe Code, which is a not-for-profit that's kind of developing standards along those lines. But in general, I think that's the first and most important step. And then the visibility and having communities that are specifically looking at problems and self-policing problems, I think that becomes very, very powerful. That's going to be your strongest deterrent against bad guys.
Let's sort of end on the final question here, which we've got a slide up here that says that, U.S. and EMEA agree that over 70% trust open source. And as we look at IT decision makers and their preferences and their trends, what, in your opinion, is the most significant advantage of open source over proprietary software? And why is this, and what's happening with this trend? Where is it, why is it moving in favor of open source?
I think it goes back to the idea that, we're not dealing in the world where we have an organization with 5 business critical applications. That was like the world I operated in 45 years ago when I started my career. Now we basically have, the average organization has thousands and thousands of things to worry about. And so we want to basically build a system that helps organizations understand quickly whether or not there are vulnerabilities or issues in the code, and having that visibility and having greater control over commercial quality applications, I think is a real plus. And I think that means that's going to translate into the adoption rate over time. We're going to see more organizations going the open source route, when they compare an application dollar for dollar and functionality and key features, they're going to look at open source all things being equal, as preferred. I think that culture is starting to change. Definitely in Europe it exists, and we're starting to see that here as well.
Well, that's great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. We'd like to invite everybody who is listening in to download the new research study by the Ponemon Institute and sponsored by Zimbra, entitled The Open Source Collaboration Study, Viewpoints on Security and Privacy in the U.S. and in EMEA. The report is available in 4 different languages: English, en français, in Italiano, and in Deutsch. It is available for download from www.zimbra.com/resources. Larry, a big thank you to you for your time today, and for all of the listeners and viewers out there, thanks for your time, and hope to see you again on another web conference call. Thank you.
Thank you.